One of the most important numbers that you should be tracking as we go into this midterm election season is how Democrats are doing versus Republicans in the generic ballot, because that's going to be a great indicator for how many seats Democrats could pick up in the House and to some extent the Senate. And it's important you don't just look at one poll. I would recommend going to a polling aggregator like Nate Silver behind me or the New York Times or Decision Desk to get a real sense at where Democrats versus Republicans are sitting at right now. Since Trump took office, the Democrats' advantage here has slowly creeped up and it now sits at 5.1 percentage points. What pollsters are asking here is if the election were held today, would you support the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? And so far in March, as you can see behind me, the numbers have not really improved for the Democrats since the start of the Iran war. They've pretty much stuck around at the same place. And you can see that the variation is still quite large, all the way from +2 to +8. And that's why it's important you go to an aggregator like Nate Silver or the New York Times, because by combining all the polls together, you reduce the influence of any one particular outlier in the sample. And the last thing to note here is who is in the sample. And you can see here we have likely voters and registered voters. And when one side is more motivated to vote than the other, the likely voter polls should show that side performing better. So I would expect Democrats to be doing better in likely voter polls than registered voter polls, because all data points to the fact that Democrats are more motivated to vote in the midterms. And in midterms, that turnout differential between base voters or Democratic and Republican voters is super, super important to predict the outcome. Now, if you're curious how a 5.1 advantage in the generic ballot shakes out for Democrats right now in terms of House control, I really love this model by MapWise Politics, which is still relatively new. And what you can do is in that slider on the bottom, you can shift that generic ballot number, and you'll see all the shades of all the districts here change on this map. And there's clearly something interesting going on behind the scenes here, because when you move the generic ballot number, the shift is not uniform across districts. So you can see here some districts are shifting a lot more from 2024 than others. So like Rio Grande Valley really stands out to me. Certain other places, Iowa, for some reason, very much stands out to me as having larger shifts than other parts of the country. And you can even click on your district and see what it thinks the results will be where you live. So this district, North Carolina 11, really stood out to me. North Carolina has a very interesting gerrymander, probably the first Republican gerrymander that would break in a real wave year. And this is probably the first district would go, which is centered around Asheville in the western part of the state. The Senate modeling here, I still think, needs some work. Senate races are also much more idiosyncratic and candidate driven and less probably predicted by the generic ballot. So you can take a look at Senate races as well, but I don't totally agree with the order of how those races shake out here.